They're live.
Hello and welcome to the July 2019 edition of the Add-ons Show and Tell. Caitlin's out, so I'm going to host today, and there's kind of a light agenda. I'm going to just post it into the chat for you guys, in case that inspires some last-minute additions. But yeah, until then, I have an item on here, and I'm going to start by trying to share my screen. Okay, so I think that's working. Yeah, it doesn't show me that it's working, but yeah, I think it is. So I've been actually demoing a couple times in the last meetings. I've been demoing this code manager tool that the review team on AMO has been using to review add-ons. And as you can see right here, there's a super large diff of minified code. So that happens often. There's also just really long code files that reviewers need to look at. So one thing I've been doing is trying to get these pages to load faster. So they were loading really slowly. And if you take a look at this one, which is maybe a little bit of an anomaly, but it is minified, and that does happen often. But this also has non-minified code in it, and there's 23,000 lines of code. And I did not want to load. This is already loaded, so I basically went to this page and clicked on it, and I'm using a developer build, and that took me 2 minutes. So I didn't want to do that during the demo. So it took 2 minutes to show this diff. And the thing I was looking at was basically trying to see what we could do to get that faster. So let me switch over. All right, I need to share a new screen, new share. Sorry, I haven't done that before. Okay, I switched to a new screen. Does everyone now see the profiler instead of the diff? Just let me know if you don't see it. I think I switched it. So I'm looking at a profiler tab here in Chrome, and I'm using Chrome because Chrome has hooks. There's like a user timing API that React uses to show actual React components in the profiler. I'm not sure how to get that working in Firefox. Maybe someone knows and they can tell me later. That would be cool. So what you can see here is I have, like I said, I've loaded this page already, so I didn't want to do that in the live demo. But this right here took 2 minutes to run. So this is like basically a single render cycle in React that took 2 minutes. And it's probably not, you might not be able to see it. I don't know if you'll be able to see it on the shared screen, but it says it took 2 minutes. And this, first of all, tells me that the slowness on this page is not caused by the API or anything like that. It is indeed caused by React. So that's the first thing I can see there. And then the second thing I can see is that the compare component, it says this is our compare component, is the one responsible for the slowness. So that's the render function in the compare component. And that's what I thought, because this is the diff, that's the components that's loading the diff. And then I could look down here, and there's a stack of other components that are slow. And basically all these components are just slow because they're waiting for their nested components to render. So if I go down this list, the last one in the list is this linter provider. And so that's really where the slowness is. So everything else above it was just waiting for that one to render. And that component right there has a render prop in it. So it's actually not the one being slow. So I know that because I know how the code is architected. So really I can look at the code itself, and I can figure out that there's a bunch of wrappers here that we're using, higher order components. And then this DiffView component is the one that is really the slow one. So that's what's rendering. All the other ones, it's using some wrappers below, but that's the slow one. And that's also not surprising because the compare page loads a diff. The diff view is what renders the actual diff, and that's what's slow. And so I can look down here a little bit farther, and I can see that diff view is using a library we use to render diffs, and that is something I'm gonna zoom in on a little bit closer so you can sort of see what's going on there. So that mounts a diff with our diff library. It renders a hunk. It has another wrapper for that hunk, and then there's a lot of renders under that for all the changes in the diff. And so each change is basically a line of code. So that totally makes sense. Like there's 20,000 lines of code. So it's got to do this rendering. It needs to render these code cells. Again, you might not be able to see this on the screen, but I can just pick one of them. And each one of this is like a little code cell. And that's all within our diff library. That makes sense. But again, this took, if I zoom out, this took 2 minutes to render, and well, I just resized my window, whoops. So not a lot, so this took 2 minutes to render, but all this mysterious stuff was happening before we got to the actual diff rendering. So actually rendering the diff. So what I wanted to show was just how you can use this profiler to, well, first of all, so, okay, I'm looking at this. So here I am, I'm looking at this DiffView component in the profiler using the React timings. Now I'm at a point where I need to figure out what's actually going on. Like, so what's actually happening that's taking so long in that function. And so what I need to do then is to scroll down into the actual function calls that happened. So not the high level kind of React component view, but the actual function calls. And this is where things start to get messy because you're looking at all the internal React functions like schedule work, perform sync work, all these different functions. So that's why it's sort of helpful to look at that React view first, where you can actually see the components. But yeah, so over here on the right is all the DiffView stuff that makes sense. That's straightforward. The stuff that doesn't make sense is within this render function of the DiffView component itself, like before we got to the actual low level diff rendering. And I can see by just looking at the longest function that the longest one here is a method in my component called getWidgets. And so this is a function that takes the entire diff and maps each line to some kind of widget if we want to add a widget. And for our case, we do add widgets for things like the linter messages. So if there's a message on a certain line, then we'll map that line to that message. That's pretty much all it does. So it just returns an object that has line numbers as the keys and maybe some messages, or maybe not. And there's really no reason why this should be taking so long, because first of all, there's only about like 8 messages in here. So this is what tipped me off to look at this function. And when I looked at it, I saw that it was basically looping over every line of code, and it had a reduce. It was calling reduce, so it had an array of lines, and it was calling reduce. And that reduce function was returning an object spread, which you can see here. So I can click down. This also might be hard to see on your screen, but it's basically calling object spread right there. And I can also, it's obviously easier to see that when I look at the code itself. And that spread is being returned for every line of the code. So essentially, that's making a copy of the entire object for every line of the code. So when we get to, you know, line 3, it's making a copy of 2 items. And then when we get to line 19,000, it's making a copy of an object with 18,999 items. So you can imagine that that's not a good idea. And the fix to that was basically not to copy the object, but just to pass the object around in a for loop with no spreads. And that basically made this function completely disappear. And it was a 3-line code change. So that's just something that was super easy to spot, super easy to fix. The profiler showed it immediately. And I mainly wanted to show this way of profiling because it's hard to intuitively think of problems like this, because intuitively looking at this diff and thinking that it's slow, my first thought was like that it was the syntax highlighting, because that's sort of intensive. And the syntax highlighting is intensive, but I'm highlighting it right here. It's called this tokenized function that does the syntax highlighting. So that one is intensive, but it didn't really take up that much time. So it was really easy to fix these other problems. And there's another function here called forward comparison map that is also creating a map, and that had the same exact problem. It was using an object spread in a reduce function. And yeah, there's way more to learn about profiling on in the React docs, but in case anyone needs to debug some performance problems, there you go. Super easy. So I went a little over 5 minutes, but it was a light agenda, so I figured, hey, why not? And I don't see anything else on the agenda. Did anyone have any questions? All right.
Good.
Thanks. So yeah, any other shows or tells? Otherwise, we'll just have some time back. All right. Well, thanks everyone.
Thanks.
See ya.